When the tranquility of the countryside is shattered by a cry for help, a young woman faces her fears to save a life trapped between currents and metal chains. But what seemed like a simple rescue reveals a dark plot, where science and ethics collide. Driven by faith in the connection between species, she defies powerful forces that want to silence the truth. And in this struggle, she finds not only answers but a call to transform the world. Before listening to this thrilling story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The morning breeze gently caressed the hills of Oregon as Emily poured food into the feeder of Thunder, her faithful Pinto horse. The sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reflected off the dewdrops still clinging to the grass. It was one of those perfect moments that made Emily grateful she had chosen to live on her grandparents' ranch after finishing her veterinary studies. "Good morning, beautiful," she whispered while stroking Thunder's muzzle. The horse responded with a soft whinny, affectionately pushing her hand in search of more caresses. It was their daily routine, waking at dawn, feeding the animals, and enjoying the peace that only the countryside could offer. However, this morning would be different. As she watched Thunder enjoy his breakfast, an unusual sound caught her attention. At first she thought it might be the wind in the trees or perhaps an early bird, but there was something about that sound that didn't fit with the usual noises of nature. It was sharper, more desperate. Emily paused, straining her ears. The sound was coming from the direction of the river that ran through the property. Without thinking twice, she began walking towards it, her work boots leaving imprints in the damp earth. As she approached, the sound became clearer. It was a whimper, an animal cry that sent chills down her spine. The river, normally calm at this hour, seemed more turbulent than usual. The rains of the past few days had increased its flow, and the brown waters carried branches and leaves in their current. It was then that she saw it, a small reddish bundle thrashing in the middle of the water, desperately fighting against something that kept it trapped. "Oh my God!" Emily exclaimed, running towards the bank. It was a fox cub, its reddish fur soaked and its eyes full of terror. The animal was tied to a rusty chain which, in turn, was connected to what appeared to be an old metal tool, keeping it anchored in the middle of the current. Emily's heart raced. The cub was losing strength, and she knew it couldn't resist much longer. She tried to enter the water, but the current was too strong and the bottom too treacherous. She needed help, and she needed it now. With trembling hands, she pulled her mobile phone from her jeans pocket and dialed the number of the only person she could trust at that moment. Sophie, her best friend since childhood and current colleague at the town's veterinary clinic. "Em, what's up? It's so early," a sleepy voice answered. "Soph, I need your help. It's an emergency. There's a fox cub trapped in the river near the ranch. It's drowning!" The urgency in Emily's voice was enough to fully awaken Sophie. "I'm on my way. Don't do anything dangerous, you hear me? Wait for me." The minutes that followed were eternal for Emily. The cub kept struggling, but its movements were becoming increasingly weaker. She talked to it constantly, trying to encourage it, while searching for a branch long enough to reach it without success. Sophie arrived in record time, her old truck skidding on the dirt road. Without a word, she quickly assessed the situation. Unlike Emily, Sophie had been a swimmer in her youth and maintained excellent physical fitness. "I'm going in," she announced, taking off her boots and jacket. "You stay on the bank with a rope. If you see the current dragging me, pull it." Before Emily could protest, Sophie was already in the water, swimming with precise movements towards the cub. The current was strong, but she was stronger still. She reached the animal and with agile fingers began working to free the chain. "It's hooked to an old metal shovel," she shouted over the noise of the water. "I need to submerge to free it." Emily held her breath as her friend disappeared beneath the surface. The seconds turned into an eternity until finally Sophie emerged with the cub in her arms, swimming back towards the shore. Between the two of them, they helped the animal out of the water. The little fox was shaking uncontrollably, its soaked fur revealing how thin it was. The rusty chain still hung from its neck, and its paws showed signs of struggle and injuries. "Who would do something like this?" Emily murmured, wrapping the cub in her jacket while Sophie recovered from the effort. "I don't know," Sophie replied, wringing out her clothes. "But this wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately tied this cub to that shovel. The animal, exhausted, had gone still in Emily's arms, its amber eyes looking at her with a mixture of fear and what seemed like gratitude. Despite its condition, there was something special in its gaze, an intelligence that went beyond what Emily had seen in other wild animals. "It needs urgent medical attention," said Sophie, examining the cub's wounds. "Let's take it to the clinic." As they loaded the animal into Sophie's truck, neither of them could imagine that this rescue would be just the beginning of an adventure that would change their lives forever. The little fox, which they would later name Bolt, held secrets that went far beyond its mysterious appearance in the river. The sun was already high in the sky when they arrived at the veterinary clinic, a modest but well-equipped building on the outskirts of town. The cub hadn't made a sound during the journey, as if it understood they were there to help it. "It's strange," Sophie commented as she prepared the examination table. "Wild foxes are usually much more agitated when we handle them. This one seems different." Emily nodded, noticing how the animal followed each of their movements with attention. "Do you think it could have been raised in captivity?" "It's possible," Sophie replied, beginning the examination. "But that only makes everything more disturbing. Why would someone want to get rid of it in such a cruel way?" The examination revealed more questions than answers. Besides the malnutrition and evident wounds, the cub had strange marks on its skin, hidden under its fur. Some looked like surgical scars, too precise to be the result of accidents or fights. "Look at this," Sophie pointed out, parting the hair on the animal's neck. "There's a pattern here, as if—" A noise at the clinic's entrance interrupted her. It was Mr. Johnson, the town's mailman, with the day's correspondence. When the girls returned their attention to the cub, they noticed it had tensed up, its ears erect and its eyes fixed on the door. "Easy, little one," Emily whispered, gently stroking its head. "You're safe here." But as she spoke those words, she couldn't help feeling that they were delving into something much bigger and more mysterious than they could imagine. The fox cub they had rescued that morning was not a common animal, and its story was just beginning to unfold. What neither of them knew at that moment was that their act of kindness had placed them at the center of a plot involving scientific secrets, forbidden experiments, and powerful people who would do anything to keep the truth hidden. The little fox now resting in their clinic was just the tip of the iceberg, and its rescue had set in motion a series of events that would forever change the quiet town in Oregon. The cub's first night at the clinic passed without incident. Emily had stayed to sleep in the small guard room, refusing to leave the newly rescued animal alone. During her night rounds, she noticed something peculiar. The fox didn't sleep like other animals. Its eyes shone in the darkness, observing every movement, every shadow, as if it were processing information. "Good morning, little Bolt," Emily whispered at dawn, the name emerging naturally due to the speed with which the cub had responded to initial treatments. The animal moved its ears upon hearing the name, as if instantly recognizing it. Sophie arrived early, carrying a briefcase full of lab results. "You won't believe what I found," she said, spreading several papers on the desk. "Bolt's blood tests show anomalies I've never seen before. Its levels of—" A sudden crash interrupted their conversation. Bolt's cage was empty, the door completely closed but with no trace of the animal. It was impossible, they had secured the lock the night before. "Bolt!" Emily shouted, running through the clinic. Panic seized her as they checked every corner of the building. There were no signs of struggle, no open doors. It was as if the cub had vanished into thin air. "Hem, look at this," Sophie called from the reception area. On the floor, barely visible, were small drops of water forming a trail towards the back door. The door was closed, but the small upper ventilation duct showed signs of having been manipulated. "How could it?" "It's too small to reach that height," Emily muttered, perplexed. Without wasting time, they followed the damp trail that extended towards the nearby forest. The rain was beginning to fall gently, threatening to erase the clues Bolt had left. As they ventured into the vegetation, they began to notice something strange. There were more tracks, but not just from Bolt. "These are tracks from other foxes," Sophie observed, crouching down to examine them better. "Many of them, and all fresh." The discovery left them puzzled. Foxes were not animals that normally moved in large groups, and especially not so close to inhabited areas. They followed the trail until they reached a clearing where the tracks multiplied, forming a circular pattern as if several animals had gathered there. "Em, look at this." Sophie pointed to something shiny among the grass. It was a fragment of the chain they had removed from Bolt the day before. The symbols engraved on the metal were now clearly visible. They weren't random marks, but a specific alphanumeric code. "Lab X23R7, Emily read aloud. "This looks like—" A distant howl interrupted them. It wasn't the normal howl of a fox. It had a different tone, almost metallic. Several more howls responded from different directions, creating an unsettling symphony that made them both shudder. "We should go," Sophie whispered, noticing that the sky was rapidly darkening with the approaching storm. Back at the clinic, they found a manila envelope at the door. It had no return address, just Sophie's name written in precise mechanical calligraphy. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message. "Specimen R7 is private property. Abandon the search. This is your only warning." Sophie crumpled the paper with trembling hands. "Someone is watching us." "We can't abandon Bolt," Emily declared firmly. "You saw its wounds, the marks. They did something to it, and now we know it's not the only one." That night, as they reviewed the clinic's security footage, they noticed something extraordinary. Moments before its disappearance, Bolt had shown behavior impossible for a normal fox. It had manipulated the lock of its cage with almost surgical precision, using its paws in a way that suggested dexterity more akin to human hands. "This isn't normal," Sophie murmured, replaying the sequence over and over. "The way it moves, how it calculated each step. It's as if it had been trained," Emily completed. "Or something worse." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the clinic's lights flickered momentarily. On the frozen screen, Bolt's image looked directly at the camera, its eyes shining with an intelligence that now seemed more ominous than extraordinary. The sound of an incoming message on Sophie's phone broke the silence. It was an unknown number, and the message contained only an image. A photograph of the two of them in the forest that very afternoon, taken without their knowledge. "Em," Sophie said with a tense voice, "I think we've gotten into something big." "And there's no turning back," Emily replied, looking out the window towards the forest darkened by the storm. Somewhere out there, Bolt and its mysterious companions were moving with a purpose they were only beginning to glimpse. The wind howled outside the clinic, carrying with it echoes of those strange sounds they had heard in the forest. The night promised to be long, and both knew that Bolt's rescue had been only the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous than they could imagine. The next morning dawned with an unsettling calm. Emily and Sophie had barely slept, taking turns to watch the clinic during the night. The threatening message and the photograph had made it clear that they were being observed, but neither was willing to back down. "We need to understand what this code means," Emily said as she examined the chain fragment again. "Lab X23R7. It must be some kind of classification system." Sophie, who had been researching on her laptop, looked up. "I've been searching for registered laboratories in the region, but there's nothing that matches those initials. However, I found something interesting. In the last 6 months, there have been reports of unusual wildlife sightings in the area." A knock at the door startled them. It was Mr. Harrison, an elderly man who lived on the outskirts of town, known for his long walks in the forest. "Ladies," he began, removing his hat, "excuse me for bothering you so early, but I think you should see something." Mr. Harrison showed them his cell phone. On the screen, a blurry photograph showed what appeared to be a group of foxes moving in perfect ordered formation, something completely unnatural for wild animals. "I saw them at dawn, near the old forest ranger's cabin," he explained. "Never in my 70 years had I seen anything like it. And there's more. One of them, the smallest, seemed to be directing the group." Emily and Sophie exchanged glances. "Could you take us to that cabin, Mr. Harrison?" The old man nodded, but his expression turned serious. "Be careful. Lately I've seen strange vehicles on those roads, people who aren't from town." The cabin was an hour's walk away, following a barely visible path through the vegetation. As they approached, the behavior of the forest animals noticeably changed. The birds fell silent, and the air became denser as if nature itself was warning of danger. The structure appeared before them, half hidden among the undergrowth. It was larger than they expected, with weathered wooden walls and dust-covered windows. What caught their attention most were the recent marks on the ground, vehicle tracks, and what appeared to be boxes or heavy equipment being dragged. "Look," Sophie whispered, pointing to the side of the cabin. There, partially hidden under old tarps, were cages of various sizes. Some had the same symbols as Bolt's chain. Cautiously, they approached the entrance. The door was closed but not secured. Inside, the air smelled of chemicals and rusted metal. The light filtering through the dirty windows revealed a disturbing scene. Examination tables, modified medical equipment, and most unsettling, powered-off monitoring screens. "This isn't a forest ranger's cabin," Emily murmured. "It's a laboratory." In a corner, they found metal filing cabinets. Most were empty, but in one they found a forgotten folder. It contained photographs and notes about what they called Project Guardian, genetic modification experiments on wild animals. "My God," Sophie exclaimed as she read. They were trying to create enhanced animals, combining DNA from different species. "Bolt isn't just a fox, it's an experiment." A sound outside the cabin alerted them. Through the dirty window, they saw figures moving among the trees. They weren't people, but foxes, at least a dozen of them, all with the same coordinated behavior Mr. Harrison had described. And at the front of the group was Bolt. The cub looked directly at them through the window, its eyes shining with that supernatural intelligence they had noticed before. But now there was something else in its gaze. Urgency, as if it were trying to communicate something to them. The noise of an engine in the distance broke the moment. The foxes instantly disappeared into the forest, moving like a well-trained unit. "Someone's coming," Mr. Harrison whispered from the door. They quickly tucked the folder into Sophie's bag and hid behind the cabin. A black vehicle without identification stopped in front of the structure. Two men in unmarked uniforms descended, carrying tracking equipment. "The tracker indicates that R7 was here recently," one of them said. "The implant is still active." "The doctor won't be happy," replied the other. "If those veterinarians discover the truth about the project, we'll deal with them later. For now, we need to recover R7 before it activates the others." Emily, Sophie, and Mr. Harrison remained motionless until the vehicle drove away. Their hearts were racing, not just from the immediate danger, but from the magnitude of what they had just discovered. "Activate the others," Emily whispered. "What does that mean?" As if answering her question, a coordinated howl resonated from different points in the forest, creating an impossible harmony that made their skin crawl. "I think," Sophie said, clutching the folder to her chest, "that Bolt isn't escaping. It's freeing the others." The sun was beginning to set when they left the cabin, each step careful and measured. They knew they had crossed a point of no return. What had begun as the rescue of a cub had become something much bigger, a conspiracy involving illegal experimentation, and at the center of it all, a small fox with a mission they were only beginning to understand. The days following the incident at the laboratory were a whirlwind of activity and revelations. News of what had occurred in the Oregon mountains spread quickly, attracting the attention of media, authorities, and scientists from around the world. Emily, Sophie, and Mr. Harrison found themselves at the center of a media storm, transformed overnight into the faces of what many were calling the Oregon Awakening. Bolt, for its part, had become a living symbol of this new era of understanding between species. The laboratory, now under public scrutiny, was transformed into an open research center, dedicated to the ethical study of interspecies communication. Dr. Heather Anderson, in a surprising turn, became the main advocate for a new ethics in genetic research. "What we have discovered goes beyond science as we knew it," Dr. Anderson explained at an international press conference. "Bolt and the other animals are not just subjects of study, they are collaborators, teachers in their own right." Meanwhile, in the Oregon forest, something extraordinary was happening. The modified animals, led by Bolt, had begun to form interspecies communities never before seen. Foxes, coyotes, raccoons, and even some birds showed levels of cooperation and communication that defied all conventional explanation. Emily and Sophie, with Mr. Harrison's help, established a sanctuary on the grounds of the old ranch. This place quickly became a meeting point for scientists, conservationists, and curious individuals from around the world, eager to observe and learn from this new form of animal interaction. "What we are witnessing," Sophie commented to a group of visiting biologists, is evolution in real time. Not just biological but social and cognitive. Bolt, although central to the entire process, maintained a discreet presence. It was often seen observing from a distance, its intelligent eyes evaluating each new development. Its connection with Emily, however, had deepened. Through subtle gestures and what could only be described as a rudimentary form of telepathy, they were able to communicate in ways that defied current understanding. One day, as Emily and Bolt walked along the edge of the sanctuary, they encountered a surprising scene. A group of scientists working in collaboration with several modified animals, using a specially designed computer interface. They're developing a new language, one of the researchers explained excitedly. A form of communication that combines gestures, sounds, and electromagnetic signals. It's as if we're witnessing the birth of a new type of collective intelligence. News of these advances spread rapidly, sparking ethical and philosophical debates around the world. What did this mean for the definition of intelligence? How would this affect laws on animal rights? While the world debated, in Oregon, the transformation continued. The animals in the sanctuary began to show increasingly complex behaviors. Cases of collaborative problem-solving were observed between species that would normally be predator and prey. The barrier between wild and domestic was beginning to blur. One night, during one of their nocturnal walks, Emily noticed that Bolt seemed particularly thoughtful. They stopped at the top of a hill, observing the lights of the sanctuary in the distance. "What do you see, Bolt?" Emily asked softly. "What future do you imagine for all of us?" In response, Bolt sat down and looked at the starry sky. Emily followed its gaze and for a moment felt a connection that transcended words. It was as if she could see, through Bolt's eyes, a future where the barriers between species faded, where intelligence and consciousness were not limited by physical form. Suddenly a howl resonated in the night, followed by another and another. It was a chorus that spanned the entire forest, each voice unique but part of a greater harmony. Emily realized she was witnessing a form of communication she was only beginning to understand. "It's beautiful," she whispered, feeling tears in her eyes. Bolt looked at her, its eyes shining with wisdom both ancient and new. At that moment, Emily understood that they were on the brink of something much bigger than they had imagined. It wasn't just about modified animals or scientific advances. It was about rediscovering the fundamental connection between all forms of life. As the chorus continued, Emily felt a wave of hope. Perhaps, she thought, this was the beginning of a new chapter in Earth's history, one where empathy and mutual understanding would guide the way towards a more harmonious future. Dawn was approaching, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was about to begin, full of possibilities and discoveries. And at the heart of it all was Bolt, a small fox that had changed the world with its courage and compassion. The adventure that had begun with a rescue in a river had become the catalyst for a global revolution. And as Emily and Bolt contemplated the new day, they both knew that their journey was just beginning. 6 months after the Oregon Awakening, the world was still adapting to the new reality that Bolt and the other modified animals had inaugurated. The sanctuary had expanded, becoming an epicenter of unprecedented interspecies research and collaboration. Emily, now internationally recognized as a pioneer in animal communication, found herself leading a multidisciplinary team that included biologists, linguists, and even artificial intelligence experts. Their goal, to develop a more sophisticated communication interface between humans and modified animals. One morning, as she worked in the sanctuary's laboratory, Sophie rushed in, her face showing a mixture of excitement and concern. "Em, you have to see this," she said, turning on a large screen. The news showed demonstrations in various cities around the world. Conservative groups are protesting against what they call the denaturalization of life, Sophie explained. They're calling for all research related to modified animals to be stopped. Emily frowned. She knew that not everyone would view these advances favorably, but the scale of the resistance surprised her. "It's not just that," Sophie continued. "There are rumors that some corporations are trying to replicate the Guardian Project experiment for commercial purposes." The news fell like a bucket of cold water. The idea that someone might try to exploit the modified animals for economic benefit was disturbing. At that moment, Bolt entered the laboratory. Although it was now common to see modified animals moving freely around the sanctuary, Bolt's presence always brought with it an air of importance. The fox approached the screen, its intelligent eyes scanning the images of the protests. Emily could sense its unease. "What do you think, Bolt?" she asked softly. In response, Bolt approached one of the communication interfaces they had developed. It was a specially designed touchpad for animals to interact with. With precise movements of its paw, Bolt began to select symbols and patterns. The interface translated, "We must show them. We are not a threat. We are a bridge." Emily nodded, understanding. "You're right. We need the world to understand that this isn't about creating super animals or playing God. It's about expanding our understanding of life and consciousness." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Emily, Sophie, and the Sanctuary team worked tirelessly on a global communications strategy. They organized live broadcasts showing daily life in the sanctuary, peaceful interactions between species, and research advances that benefited both humans and animals. Bolt and other modified animals actively participated in these demonstrations. They showed problem-solving skills, interspecies empathy, and even artistic creativity. A particularly moving moment was when Bolt and a group of modified raccoons collaborated to create a complex structure that served as a shelter for migratory birds. However, not everything was positive. Reports of attempted kidnappings of modified animals began to arrive from different parts of the world. Unscrupulous corporations and governments interested in the military potential of these animals were making moves in the shadows. One night, as Emily worked late in the laboratory, the sanctuary alarms were activated. An armed group had attempted to infiltrate the perimeter. The animals' reaction was immediate and surprising. Without need for human direction, different species coordinated to create a living barrier around the sanctuary. Bolt led the defense, using its enhanced intelligence to anticipate and counteract each move of the intruders. When the authorities arrived, they found the infiltrators already subdued and contained, without any violence having occurred. This incident, captured on video, went viral within hours, dramatically changing public perception. The world saw not only the intelligence of these animals, but also their capacity to act with compassion and restraint, even in the face of a direct threat. In the days that followed, Emily and her team were summoned to a special session of the United Nations. It was time to present their case to the world. Standing before the assembly, with Bolt by her side, Emily felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. But when she began to speak, her voice was full of conviction. "What we are witnessing is not the end of nature as we know it," she declared. "It is the evolution of our understanding of life itself. These animals are not creations to be exploited, but conscious beings with whom we can learn and grow together." Bolt, using a portable version of the communication interface, added its own statement. "We are different, but not separate. Consciousness knows no species. Together we can build a world where all voices are heard." As the assembly digested these words, Emily understood that they were on the threshold of a new era. The challenges would be many, but for the first time in history, humans and animals were truly united in a common destiny. The Oregon chapter had been just the beginning. Now the entire world was preparing to rewrite the history of life on Earth. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Emily found Bolt fighting for its life in the river. The world had changed in ways that no one could have predicted, and the small sanctuary in Oregon had become the epicenter of a global revolution. On a cool spring morning, Emily found herself at the top of a hill, observing the vast complex that now stretched before her. The original sanctuary had expanded to become the Interspecies University of Oregon, a center for learning and collaboration unprecedented in human history. Bolt, now an adult fox but with the same intelligent gleam in its eyes, sat beside her. Together, they contemplated the bustle of activity below. Human students walking alongside various modified animals, all participating in an exchange of knowledge that transcended traditional communication barriers. "Did you ever imagine we'd come this far?" Emily asked, gently stroking Bolt's fur. The fox turned to an advanced communication device it wore on an elegant collar. The synthetic voice, perfected over the years, responded, "Dreams often fall short of the reality we can create together." Emily smiled, remembering the long and sometimes difficult path that had led them to this point. The initial protests, The kidnapping attempts, the legal and ethical battles, it all seemed so distant now. The Declaration of Rights for Conscious Beings, signed 2 years ago in a historic United Nations session, had marked a before and after. For the first time, the consciousness and rights of non-human beings were legally recognized, establishing a new paradigm in the relationship between species. Sophie, now director of the Department of Interspecies Medicine, joined them on the Hill. "The new generation of students has arrived," she announced enthusiastically. "And you won't believe this. We have our first elephant student." The news didn't surprise Emily as much as it would have years ago. The neural network developed by Bolt and the first modified animals had expanded, allowing more species to access elevated levels of consciousness and communication. "The Species Council will meet this afternoon," Sophie reminded her. "They're eager to discuss the next big project." The Species Council, a governing body formed by human and animal representatives, had been fundamental in the transition towards this new era of coexistence and collaboration. As they walked down the hill towards the main campus, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The laboratories that were once scenes of questionable experiments were now spaces for joint discovery. The old cages had been transformed into classrooms where humans and animals exchanged knowledge on equal terms. At the center of the campus, a statue of Bolt stood as a symbol of this new beginning. It wasn't a monument to vanity, but a reminder of how an act of compassion could trigger change on a global scale. The Species Council meeting was, as always, a spectacle of diversity and unity. Representatives of different species communicated through advanced interfaces, debating and collaborating on projects ranging from ecological restoration to space exploration. The central theme of the meeting was ambitious: the terraforming of Mars. With a combination of human technology and the unique abilities of various modified species, what was once science fiction now seemed within reach. "Imagine," proposed a modified dolphin through its interface, "oceans on Mars populated by species adapted to survive there. We could create a new home not just for humanity, but for all terrestrial life." The discussion that followed was exciting, full of innovative ideas and unique perspectives that only this interspecies collaboration could generate. At the end of the meeting, Bolt took the floor. "We have come a long way from that river in Oregon. Each step has taught us that true evolution is not in genetic modification, but in the expansion of our compassion and mutual understanding. The next great leap of consciousness will not be in a laboratory, but in the hearts and minds of all conscious beings." That night, as the sun set over the Interspecies University, Emily found herself again on the Hill, this time accompanied not only by Bolt, but by a diverse family of conscious beings: Sophie, Mr. Harrison, now a respected professor of ancestral wisdom, Dr. Anderson, and a variety of modified animals that had become close friends over the years. As they watched the stars, each reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them there, Emily felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. The future, with all its challenges and possibilities, stretched out before them like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of cooperation and mutual understanding. Bolt, as if reading her thoughts, approached and rested its head on Emily's lap. Through its device, it shared a final thought for the night: every ending is a new beginning. Our story is just beginning. And so, under the starry sky of Oregon, with the world transformed and a future full of promises ahead, Emily understood that the true miracle had not been genetic modification or advanced technology. The true miracle had been the awakening of empathy and understanding among all forms of life. The adventure that had begun with the rescue of a small fox in a turbulent river had unleashed a wave of change that now extended towards the stars. And at that moment, surrounded by friends of all species, Emily knew that this was just the beginning of an even greater chapter in the history of life in the universe.